Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first summer forum session of 2015. Earlier this week, when I was reflecting on how I might start this program, I was thinking, well, today is summer solstice, so I'd say something about that. Today is Father's Day, and Unitarians celebrate Father's Day in at least a dozen different ways that I've become aware of. But what has been on my mind, of course, all this week is the fact that we are gathered here in a house of worship that is a safe place. Something many can no longer take for granted. So many feelings welled up this week about the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina. Each of you have a lot of your own feelings about your own personal pain and also about the national conversation. The most hopeful thing I can say this morning is that this congregation is organizing an anti-racism committee. Its acronym is ARC, which reminds me of one of Dr. King's most famous sayings, that the arc of the universe is long but bending toward justice. You might have seen that our arc set up a Black Lives Matter banner outside to show some solidarity. At the end of the service, you may want to go by a table where some of our committee members have a card that we'd like all of you to sign, which will be mailed to the congregation, the AME congregation in Charleston. And also, we would like to make some donations from our community. So if you've come prepared with checks or cash, that will also be something that they'll tell you how to write it out and so on. But all I know is that in times of grief, all I can say is turn your grief outward toward a rededication of your intent to live a life of justice. I've asked some singers from our choir to begin our program today with some music that comes from a cantata, Jack Newell, about the desert. So our first song will be about living on a mountain and smelling the air and wondering if this living on a mountain, does it mean that you're about to fall off? Or can you imagine angels' wings bearing you up? Singers and Holly, let's hear from you.
Everything I
It says here I'm going to be offering an introduction of the speaker. First of all, raise your hand if you already know who Jack Newell is. Boy, that's going to make this really short. What has inspired my interest in learning about Dr. Newell is his role both as a president of probably the most unusual college in America, and also coming back here to the University of Utah and teaching about leadership. And I thought, well, guess what? This is a progressive institution. We haven't learned all there is to know about growth. Let's hear whether Professor Newell can draw on his wisdom through the years and offer us something, and it'll be our role then to pick up on what he has to say and then bring it back into the life of this congregation. It's my privilege to welcome Jack Newell. Thank you.
This is an elevated position indeed at this pulpit. Now I can see Tom Goldsmith from his perch as well as our own. I'm so honored to be able to kick off the summer forum and deeply moved by Harold's introductory remarks about the tragedy in Charleston. And it moves us all, I think, to consider again what can we do in our place and in our time. In a time that we thought we had gotten past so many, many years ago, so many decades ago. And thank you to the quartet for the lovely music. The desert indeed was very important, not only in my own development, but in the idea of the founder of Deep Springs College, L.L. Nunn. And I wanted to read a couple of passages about his reflection on the desert and its capacity to center us and to bring us to a clarity of thought and moral action that is so badly needed. Gentlemen, he wrote, for what came ye into the wilderness, not for conventional scholastic training. He's now talking about his Deep Springs College. Not for conventional scholastic training, not for ranch life, not to become proficient in commercial or professional pursuits for personal gain. You came to prepare for a life of service. Those who listen will hear the purpose, philosophy, and ethics of Deep Springs on the desert. And then another passage here. The few have often come out of the desert, the eternal silence of the desert. This is not a fanatic life of asceticism, but a short season of preparation for the work of the few, the great work, the heavy toil of leadership. A product of Deep Springs myself, I'm a believer that the responsibility of leadership is something that falls on each of our shoulders. It's not something that elected representatives or others bear alone. In fact, in many cases, I think the greatest leadership in our society has arisen from the people who were moved by justice, who were moved by mercy, and decided to conform their lives to those great ideas and great ideals. The topic I was given this morning kind of grew out of a conversation between Harold and me, how progressive institutions can grow, which is not, frankly, exactly what I had in mind, but we'll make this work. And I asked if he could put on to the, as a subtitle, The Remarkable Case of Deep Springs College. Deep Springs College celebrates its centennial about 2 years from now, in 2017. And it's a college founded by a visionary moral leader who was active in a whole variety of pursuits. And let me step back, therefore, and take you through the brief history of L.L. Nunn himself, and then we'll talk about the college and why a book that started out. My field is the history of colleges and universities. And having gone to Deep Springs as a youth, having taught there early in Linda's and my marriage when we were in our 20s, and then having gone back to lead the institution in 1995 to 2004, it's become so much a part of the fabric of our lives. But the ideals of the college are something which have been passed down from generation to generation of students. And if we were to look at why some institutions are able to hold on to their progressive vision, to keep their ideals at the very heart and to conform to those, the last place in the world you would expect that to happen would be at Deep Springs College, where the faculty turns over. The maximum faculty appointment at Deep Springs is for 6 years. Then you have to move on. Students stay there only 2 years. It's a junior college, which gives the student the first half of an undergraduate degree, the liberal education half, after which they transfer to the college or university of their choice to finish their major and go on. 50% of them over time have gone on to earn doctoral degrees, PhDs in medicine, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a place that seems to inspire a great deal of dedication on the part of its students. And that dedication has manifested itself on a number of occasions in demanding that the college continue to hearken to the moral vision of its founder. Where did he come from? L.L. Nunn was born in northern Ohio in 1853. His parents had recently immigrated from England, and they came to the United States because they were religious dissenters, and they were also interested in giving their children the best possible opportunity to excel in life. They'd already had 9 children before they came to the U.S., and L.L. Nunn and his twin were born, as I said, in the spring of 1853. Interestingly, his name was Lucian Lucius Nunn, and they named his twin brother Lucius Lucian Nunn. What kind of parents would do that, I have no idea. So Nunn prized his initials, partly because his twin brother died when he was 3 years of age. And so since they both had the same initials, L.L. Nunn, he took that as his lifelong way of presenting himself. So formally, he was Lucian L. Nunn, but everyone seemed to know him wherever he was as L.L. Being born during the Civil War, he knew responsibility from an early age, because most of the men in that northern Ohio community where the family lived were off to fight in the Civil War. He had a reading disability, which I think would be akin to dyslexia today, although it seems not to have been exactly that, but he did not read easily. And though his older siblings had gone on to school and done very well, he went to a boarding school in Cleveland by a rather famous woman who ran it there, only for a couple of years. And then his older brothers were studying at Oberlin College, which was relatively new at the time, in the nation's first coeducational institution in 1837. And he went there as a 13-year-old, kind of hanging out with his 2 older brothers who were registered at the college, who were enrolled at the college. And they set up a couple of businesses together, growing hedge for hedgerows, that's before the era of barbed wire, and keeping bees. And these 2 businesses became quite important. But at the age of 13, when Nunn arrived there with his siblings, he was profoundly affected by Charles Grandison Finney, who was, if you are familiar with that part of our history, one of the great anti-slavery pastors who spent much of his career in New York generating dissent against the practice of slavery. And from Finney, who kind of took young Nunn under his wing, Finney had been president of Oberlin for a number of years, and just about the time that Nunn arrived, he had retired from the presidency and was an old guy who was retired on the faculty. He had time to invest in people, and he identified this young Nunn as somebody that he might take under his wing, which he did. So Nunn proceeded from there to engage in other businesses with his brothers, and then had saved as much as $10,000 in the 1860s. Amazing. And he and one of his brothers decided they would go to Europe. They wanted to seek truth by going from place to place. And indeed, they did that. And when they came home, they were both inspired by the ideas they had encountered in Europe, and it helped Nunn to focus his moral vision from what Finney had given him to put it in a larger philosophical context. He was a philosopher at heart. And this moral vision became expressed in the term the moral order of the universe, which is something that he invested the students with Deep Springs in continuing. The idea was that the universe has great moral laws to which we should hearken and conform our lives, which were comparable, in his view, to physical laws, like gravity and so forth. And so he wrote a well-known piece at the time for the Anti-Literal Society in northern Ohio, in Mansfield, Ohio, and then at the age of 27 decided that he would adopt the same vision that drove Frederick Remington and Teddy Roosevelt west, and many other young men at the time who would go west to test their mettle against the mountains and the challenges of a new and frontier society. He arrived in Leadville when he began his quest, and he and a buddy named Malachi Kinney set up an improbable restaurant called the Pacific Grotto, and Leadville was the boom town that it was. They did rather well, but something went awry after about the first year and a half, and they decided that maybe they should leave Leadville and proceed to Durango. And they landed in Durango, and it too was just a tiny little western town. And they set up a new Pacific Grotto, and it became the haunt of 29 desperados who were basically ruling that part of Colorado. And they didn't know quite what to do about this, but it was lucrative, and so they continued to serve these guys, and probably afraid not to. And two things happened at about that time, and one of them was that the sheriff of the town stumbled into their Pacific Grotto late one night when there was the usual drinking and partying going on among the miners who were there, and the sheriff pulled out his side gun and he shot the lights out in the establishment and then stumbled out drunk and went away. Nobody was sure what was going on with this. But shortly thereafter, the county sheriff and others called a posse together, and they decided it was finally time to round up these 29 desperados. So they called on Nunn and his companion Malachi Kinney and said, we need you to join the posse. You know these guys better than anyone, and you can help us to round them all up. They quickly recognized that they were in a crossfire, and so they decided this would be a good time to duck out of Durango. And so they took some carpentry tools and whatever they could carry on their backs, and they hiked over the Uncompahgre Range in southwestern Colorado and ended up in Telluride. Telluride, Colorado at the time was one of the latest boom towns, and they were just staking out this town plat when Nunn and his buddy arrived. They began shingling roofs for people, and then they began doing more serious carpentry work. And one thing led to another, and he rather quickly found that he had skills for management. And so he hired out to manage one of the main mines that was flourishing in the Telluride area. That seemed to go well, and before long somebody else asked if he would manage their mine as well, and he took on another one and another one and another one. And then it dawned on him, maybe I should just have my own mines instead of managing these for other people. So he became a serious mine manager and mine operator and owner. But at the same time, he had, by the way, earned a law degree at Harvard. And so he decided that he would go into the practice of law in this sort of lawless area of western Colorado, and hung out his shingle and began adjudicating conflicts between people over mining claims and water rights and all kinds of things. And by the way, to get a law degree in those days, you would find somebody in a prestigious law firm to sponsor you, and then you would read Blackstone and other law texts under their tutelage for as much as 6 months, maybe no more. And then they would recommend you to go to law school, which he did this in Boston, so they recommended that he go to Harvard Law School, which was 1 semester, at the end of which you received your law degree and then you went forth to practice. So that's the kind of an attorney that L.L. Nunn was when he arrived in Colorado. He quickly began developing real estate interests in the area. There was a need for a bank in town, so he founded the bank. There was one newspaper in town, and he didn't like it, so he founded another newspaper. He was quickly very centrally involved in everything, and he was making a lot of money with these mines particularly. The other things seemed to be dabbling. Serious dabbling in some cases. Now, he goes on from there to face this problem. He owns the bank, the newspaper, he owns real estate interests in town as well as outside of town, and suddenly in the late 1880s there is a energy shortage in Telluride. The stamp mills that they used to crush the ore had been run by steam engines, and the steam engines were operated by burning wood that they had cut down on the hillsides. Well, by the late 1880s, they had burned most of the wood off the hillsides. And therefore, his mines, as well as everybody else's, were facing bankruptcy. There was no way they could reduce the ore and make these mining operations work. It became a real crisis by the 1889-90, and there was a lot of hand-wringing, and people were leaving town. People were deciding what in the world they could do. And now we find a kind of the essential none manifest himself. He thought, we've got to find some way to find cheaper power. And he was a kind of intellectual gadfly, and he had read about Nikola Tesla's theory of alternating current, that it could transmit electricity much more efficiently over long distances, over smaller wires, because it didn't develop the heat in the transmission. And he read further and found out that George Westinghouse in Pittsburgh was developing the technology to produce alternating current equipment. So when everybody else was scratching their heads and falling into depression in Telluride, he gets on the train, goes to Pittsburgh. He's arranged a meeting with George Westinghouse. Westinghouse says, yes, let's meet with my board and present your idea. Nunn said, I could build the dam, the flume, the power plant, install the Pelton wheel, and run power lines up to my Gold King mine about 2.5 miles away, which was an unheard of distance at that time to transmit power. If you, George Westinghouse, and your board would agree to build a 100 horsepower generator, alternating current, high voltage, and a matching 100 horsepower motor that can be installed at the mine to run the stamp mill. Now, Nunn goes to the board meeting, he presents the idea, and the board looks at him and says, who is this pipsqueak anyway? L.L. Nunn was 5'2" if he stood on his tiptoes. He weighed 118 pounds. He had laser-like eyes and absolutely perfect diction. He made his pitch, and the board said, we don't think so. That's a very poor bet. You remember now that they're challenging the monopoly that Edison has with direct current. So they walk out of the meeting, Nunn and Westinghouse says, that board has no guts. He said, I'll go into this with you personally. I will put up the money for my company to build the equipment for you. You go back out to Telluride and set up the whole system that you've described. So with a handshake, they did that. And by the way, one of the funny little stories is that the myth, which had even been written by an early historian of Deep Springs, was that Nunn took $100,000 in gold in a canvas bag and plopped it on the board's table when he was arguing that they should join him in this adventure. I got thinking, how much would $100,000 in gold weigh in 1890? Would have weighed 263 pounds. L.L. Nunn weighed 118. I don't think he plopped this. Historians have a lot of fun with things like that. So let me tell you where we go next. Nunn goes back to Telluride, and he makes good on his promise, builds the dam, installs the penstocks, the power plant, everything is all ready to go. And on cue, a train arrives that they had recently built to bring coal into the mining district because they thought they could replace the steam engine's fuel source from wood to coal. It didn't work, by the way, but at least they had the railroad to bring in these two big heavy pieces of equipment. They installed this equipment, and they had no idea in a new technology like this what would happen when you get current at 3,300 volts, which is what this original experiment was about. The thing about alternating current is you can step up the voltage to a very high level, which makes it efficient for transmission, and then you can step it back down to use it. It'd be like a water tap if we were to have, say, a water tower that's high up on the side of the mountain, and it brings water to your house, and that water might be under 500 pounds pressure, but before it comes into your house, the water company has a reducer, and they bring the power down, or the pressure down maybe to 40 pounds. Otherwise, you turn on the spigot, and it would blow the toothbrush out of your hand and maybe knock you over. So that's the way it works with electricity. This is what you can do with AC. So none was doing this. They didn't know, however, if you put this high voltage power into wires and ran it up to the mine, if when you went from one power pole to another, if the electricity would follow the wire, or it would jump out of the wire and become a lightning bolt and shoot over and hit the side of the mountain. So they strung these wires as straight as they possibly could. And on a June day in 1891, there's a big knife switch set up there. They get the RPMs up just exactly where they want them, and somebody throws the big knife switch. It was probably Nunn himself. There was an arc came across it, scared everybody to death. It closed. There was a teletype up at the mine, and comes the telegraph message that the stamp mill had leaped into action up there instantly. The experiment worked. This was the first time in world history where there had been a significant separation between the spot at which you generate power to where it could be used. 2.5 miles seems like nothing to us today, but it opened the way to what we know as the modern electrical grid. It made world news. Now, suddenly, of course, everybody else says, hey, could you build one of those for my mine? And so Nunn was very quickly moving out of the mining business himself and began taking contracts to build these same power plants. And this led him not only to a lot of successes in the area of Colorado where he was, but he thought big, and before long he sent out his lieutenants and he said, find the places in the West. There's lots of there are high mountains with lots of winter snow that hold that snow so it'll run all year, and then I can build my power plants down low, and there is demand for electricity. Where did they find this to be? Utah. And so Nunn moved here about in the mid-1890s, about 1895, and began building power plants all the way from southern Idaho, Logan Canyon, all the way down to Beaver, Utah. But most especially, he thought the potential was greatest in Provo Canyon, coming into Utah Valley. So he built what was a state-of-the-art power plant there. There were people coming from all over the world who wanted to study what he was doing, and that was great. But he had another problem. That is, he couldn't take his workers from the mines and have them suddenly start running power plants, because this was a highly technological thing, and it had to be done manually in those days. Today, these kind of things are all automated. But you had to have workers who would be able to get the RPMs up to exactly the right point so that the current and voltage were where they should be, and then suddenly you would connect this to the power grid, which it was also synchronized in that same way, and you could electrify a factory or a mine or whatever it is you were trying to do. Old people couldn't do this. Now, we can all relate to this because we remember the coming of computers. Still can. Grandchildren can run circles around those of us who have gray hair in this room. It was the same with the technology at that time with electricity. So Nunn found that his loyal workforce for many years just couldn't do the job. And he turned to 18-year-olds who were graduating from high school, established a network where he could find lots of these young men, and he would hire them to manage his power plants. And right away he devised a method which we would call a kind of an internship or an apprenticeship today. And that is, he would identify the young men that he thought were particularly apt, bright, and they would work in his power plant full-time the first year. If they did well at that, the second year, he would take them to Provo Canyon, where he had established the main school that he had, and in there they would work half-time and they would study half-time with professors who were on leave from places like the University of Utah, Utah State, and BYU, on leave or somehow squeezing this into their schedules. If they did well at that, Nunn would then say, your third year, you're a full-time student, and I'm going to give you the best education I can. At first, he was interested primarily in teaching them electrical energy, electrical engineering, electrical theory. It wasn't long, however, before he became more and more interested in that old interest of his, those progressive ideas, justice, liberty, and the like. And so by the time he had gotten his power plant schools coming along, by the time students were doing a third year there, they were studying the liberal arts and sciences, not electricity. If they did well at that, then he said, now I want to send you to the finest universities in the country, and so that you can pursue your education. He did this, and he did it beautifully, and at one time it appears that he had at least 400 students that he was paying their tuition to attend Ivy League schools, Berkeley, and other major schools around the country. And now he runs into trouble with the co-investors. James Campbell was a well-known, wealthy investor from St. Louis who had been involved in a lot of nuns' enterprises as a co-investor. And we come to 1907, and there is the panic of 1907, as you may know, which was something like the Great Recession that we just went through. And the problem was, what do we do now? And the James Campbell, who becomes the antagonist to none, says, you got to stop wasting money on educating these kids. I want dividends for myself and for our stockholders. Those educational diversions, as he called them, have got to stop. And so they ended up being engaged in a court battle from 1907 to 1912, during which Nunn decided it was time for him to prepare to do what he was now dreaming of most, and that was he wanted to found an educational system that would produce leaders, I think it would be appropriate to say, kind of like himself. He viewed himself as a successful model of how a person ought to be, and the responsibility that they should have. And so this battle went on between Campbell charging Nunn first within the company and the company audits, and then going all the way to the federal district court in Colorado with mismanagement of the company. In the meantime, Nunn takes most of the resources that he had at that time, and he founds the Telluride Association at Cornell, and he gives a bunch of students complete control of a large portion of his resources, so that if he lost the suit with Campbell, his educational dream could go on. Well, in the end, he wins the suit with Campbell. And it had been a bitter, bitter struggle, and as soon as he had won, he turned to Campbell, wrote him a letter, and he said, okay, buy me out. I'm exonerated, I won, admit it, you can have the company. And so he turned the company to Campbell, and then he turned the rest of his life. He now, by the way, had just been diagnosed with tuberculosis and was in serious trouble, and he knew it. So he wanted to spend the rest of his life and the rest of his resources to trying to develop an educational institution that would do more explicitly and more directly what he had been trying to do in these power plant schools. So now we'll fast forward. Let me read, no, I'm going to wait and read that in just a second here. What he established at Cornell was kind of a scholarship house for upper division students. The idea was originally that the kids who had their first couple of years in his power plant of education would transfer to the Telluride house at Cornell, and there they would take their upper division work, but they would live in this self-governing house. And that worked pretty well, but his real dream then was to found his primary branch, that is the college where students would get their liberal education, not connected with the power plant, but completely devoted to the best thinking about education that he and John Dewey and others could come up with. And so 1917 arrives, and he has identified the desert as the place where he wants his students to be educated, a la those quotations that I read when we started here. And he is determined that this education is going to be one that educates the so-called whole person. So Deep Springs was founded on 3 pillars in 1917 when he founded the college out there. Academics, which is a typical thing for a college to focus on, but co-equally, 2 other things that other colleges don't. One of them was labor, that students should work at least 20 hours a week or roughly half-time at hard, challenging labor. And at that time, farm work was done with teams of horses and mules, and he thought just learning how to handle those horses and mules and how to harness them, how to care for them and so forth was an important part of the education. But he wanted them to have hard labor experiences. The third pillar, equally important, was self-governance. He said this college should be owned by the students. They're not going to be scholarship recipients. They're not going to be customers, as colleges and universities often look at students today. These students are going to be the owners of the college when they're here. And therefore, they will be charged with making decisions about who will teach, what courses will be offered, whether the cattle or the herd should be reduced or expanded in size. Everything to do with this whole operation, which combined an agricultural operation and a college, would be in the hands of students with just one person who could override them, and that was the president of the college. The president of the college was given power to override the students so they couldn't make decisions that might imperil the life of the college itself. So he sets this in motion in 1917, and he thought he had endowed it in a way that would work and carry on. He moved from Salt Lake City to Deep Springs, and Deep Springs, by the way, is located about 30 miles from the closest town, which is Big Pine, California. And it's in a beautiful valley all to itself. There's nothing else in Deep Springs Valley except the ranch and the college on which it's founded. Now I'm going to tell you a couple of more things about Deep Springs. It's the smallest, most remote, most selective institution in the country, most selective right up there with Caltech and Harvard in terms of the qualifications of the students it admits. Smallest, I said, it admits 13 students a year, sometimes as many as 15. So the student body is typically 26 to 30 students. Most remote, closest town, 28 miles away. The valley that I just described is between two federally designated wilderness areas. You're out there alone. Another important part of this is that the public utilities don't reach Deep Springs except for electricity, and so all of the infrastructure of the college is maintained by the college itself, and that responsibility falls primarily to the students. Now, all of the different student jobs, whether they're the mechanic or the cook or the butcher or the cowboy, there is a professional on staff who knows those skills and whose task is to coach the students so that they can exercise those responsibilities themselves, but not to do the jobs. So it's an interesting task if you're at Deep Springs and you're choosing the staff, because you have to choose people who have high levels of skill, but you're saying, but don't do it yourself. Get the students to do these things and to do them as well as you can. Now I want to talk about how much time do I have left here, Harold? I didn't look at my... About 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. That's just perfect. Now let's go back to Telluride, Colorado, when the sheriff came in and shot out the lights. Another subtitle for my talk could be How a 90-Year-Old Woman Changed Our Understanding of L.L. Nunn at Deep Springs College. Shortly after Nunn died, in 1925, by the way, just 7 years after he founded the college, his brother, who was his partner in most of his business affairs and two of his top lieutenants in the company, Telluride Power being the main company, seized a trunk full of his personal papers, which he had saved meticulously, and destroyed them. Why did they destroy these? Well, there's been a lot of speculation about why they would do that. We do know that they were very interested in getting a major biography written of Nunn. They wanted to establish him as the innovator and historic figure that he was, and there was something in those letters in the trunk that apparently was bothering them. So about 5 years ago, I was trying to piece together this story, this big gap between Nunn's kind of leaving home when he was 17 or 18 years old, and when he becomes highly involved in developing that power plant that makes world history. I get a call from a woman who says, "My name is Helen Heckman, and I'm 90 years old, and I live in Apple Valley, California." And she said, "I understand you're writing a book about L.L. Nunn." And I said, "And Deep Springs College, that's true." And she said, "I've been the Nunn family historian all my life, and I've been waiting to find someone that I could give my Uncle Lou's papers to." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, I've got a whole room of my house I have dedicated solely to keeping these files and these documents." Well, Linda and I were down there. Linda, by the way, was my full partner in doing all of the research for this book. We were down there in 24 hours. Helen welcomes us into her home, and she says a few nice words, and she collects elephants, and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren have been giving her elephants forever, so the living room is full of elephants, all kinds. But we just remark on this and a couple of other things. She says, "Oh, come on, let's go back to my studies." So we go back to this bedroom, which is lined with 4 high file cabinets all the way around the entire room. It's not a small bedroom. And then bookshelves up above that are just full of books that had been nuns' books. And so she's talking to us, and she's picked out a sheaf of papers that are on top of this filing cabinet right here. She pulls them out, and while she's talking with Linda, she hands them to me, and she says, "Have a look." So I start looking at these papers, and it's correspondence between Nunn's elder siblings about him and his younger brother, P.N. Nunn. And first, it's really exciting. They're talking about how these guys are not ever going to be self-supporting. Remember, this is in Durango, that the rest of us are going to have to figure out some way to take care of these kids because they're irresponsible. Nothing good will ever happen with them. And then I look back at her, and she's, of course, waiting for me to give a reaction. And she kind of smiles, and I go to hand them back to her, and she says, no, I think you ought to have those. And then, without saying anything, another sheaf of papers, hands them to me, keeps on talking with Linda. This sheaf of papers, correspondence between these older siblings, are saying, he is an embarrassment to the family. This is absolutely mortifying. Our younger brother, LL, would be better off dead. And then it turns out that he's asking them, please, he wants to go back east. He's had his experience in the West, and he needs to go home. He's 27 at this point. And they're saying, should we send him the money? No, let's don't. It would be too embarrassing for us to have him around. And then another sibling says, we probably ought to send him the money for our parents' sake. They would feel awful if we were to abandon him. Well, it turns out that he's got venereal disease or he's gay. And the more we looked into this, and she keeps giving me documents and so forth as we're talking, turns out almost certainly he was gay. Remember the sheriff who stumbled into their establishment and blew out the lights that night, and then asks he and his buddy, who was probably his gay partner, to join the posse? It all begins to fit together. Now, here's the importance of this to L.L. Nunn's story. Always wondered, where did his progressive idealism come from? His passion for justice, his detesting religious bigotry, his passion to stop racism in any form that he could. Once you put this together and you begin to understand what happened, this man was on the periphery himself. And I think this is often true with people who develop a strong social conscience. If you're on the edge on one way or the other, you begin instantly to be able to identify with and sympathize with other people who are on the margins of society and realize how tough their road is. And so when Nunn begins the college, he has not only these 3 pillars that I mentioned of academics, labor, and self-governance, but he has 3 principles that shine out. He never articulated them as such, but they're so clear in the history of the college. He was against racism, he was against religious bigotry, and these were eras where religious bigotry was very, very big. And he was against any form of indoctrination as a form of education. He said, what you do to educate someone to become a moral agent is you present them with all the information about the issues that are under study. You present them with all the arguments that people make about what the right decision would be, and then you get out of the way. And becoming educated is learning to grapple with all those arguments, to consider all of the evidence, and to arrive at your own conclusion. That was his vision for the college. So, very briefly, let me say that he turned the college over to 8 trustees and a student trustee when he died, and these were the ideals that had shown through. Now, he unfortunately appointed these trustees who were relatively young when he appointed them. They were mainly lieutenants in his company for life, and some of them served from 1923 when he set up the Board of Trustees into the 1970s. And they carried with them not the high social vision of LL Nunn, but they were trapped in racist views, they were trapped in religious bigotry, and they experimented from time to time with trying to turn Deep Springs into a kind of place to indoctrinate people as anti-communist agents or one thing or another. And time after time, the college came right to the brink of going under. And then the students would remember, wait a minute, we read Nunn's letters, which are contained in a little book called the Gray Book, and we know what he stood for. And self-governance is the essence of this college, and we are not going to let the trustees take this college away from us. We are not going to let them exclude Jews in the 1940s and the 1950s. We are not going to let them, and the president they appointed just before 1960, turn this into a McCarthyite ideological training ground. It will not happen. So the story of Deep Springs College is really the story of how someone who is inspired by a high moral vision with progressive values turns his dream over to people of much lesser vision. And time again, that college has almost failed. It's gone right to the brink. But the miraculous thing is that we now approach the centennial of the college. It's in the best shape I think it's ever been. And if L.L. Nunn were here today, I think he would say, my stars, I can't believe it. It's doing what I wanted it to do. Now, when we get to the Q&A, here's the thing that we need to talk about. Deep Springs is an all-male institution. Deep Springs was founded before the women's suffrage amendment. Nunn was gay. Practically all of his associates were with men, and he was in a men's profession and in a men's part of the world, the American West, frontier times, and so forth. So, what then can we say about coeducation today? The primer will be this for you. 3.5 years ago, the board voted almost unanimously to embrace coeducation after 50 years of conflict. It depends to a very high degree, by the way. You might notice, oh, I haven't told you that it's free. You're an owner of the college when you're there. You pay no tuition, no fees. Room and board, everything is provided because, after all, it belongs to you. If you were paying tuition, you'd say, why should I lift a finger? You can't do that at Deep Springs. So the college, therefore, has come into, after 50 years of conflict over this, and depended on a lot of older trustees and older alumni who were able to give the money to keep the college going with this ideal. And suddenly it embraces coeducation. But there were 2 dissenters on the board, and they brought charges against the college in court to block coeducation from happening, and it's still in court, almost 4 years after the decision was made. The arguments, I'd love to talk about in Q&A. Thanks so much for listening.
Generally, what I like to do is to start someplace down here and then over here and work my way back and then forward. So is there anyone in this part of the room that has a question? I'll take you first. Anyone on this side? How about someone on this side? Anybody ready to form a question? Yeah.
So who pays for the education if it's free? Because clearly the staff is being compensated.
How does something like this work, a free college? As you might guess, Deep Springs inspires a lot of loyalty on the part of most of the students who go there. Now, the whole idea of the college is, I'm going to give you, I'm quoting Nunn now, paraphrasing Nunn, I'm going to give you the best, most comprehensive education I can possibly dream up. And your responsibility is to own this place while you're here, set your own self-interest aside, and then go forth and serve humanity. So the fact is that many of the alumni have done exactly that, but often serving humanity is not necessarily building large fortunes. And so Deep Springs has depended on lots of alumni giving generously with what they have in order to keep the college going over all these years. It's also been fortunate that there have been a few alumni who have made it very big, and they have tended to be quite clever about getting all the rest of us to give at higher levels. One example, and that is David Hitz is the co-founder of NetApp, a huge Silicon Valley company. And so he is able to do a lot for the college, but he does it by doing things like this. Every year there's a different HITS challenge. It's an interesting name, HITS, in this regard. And that is, he will say, I will do a quadruple match of what everybody from the classes of the 1960s will give, more than they have ever given before. So if you've been giving $1,000 a year, if you'll give $2,000 a year, then he'll quadruple that in his own. Another time he'll say, I will quadruple the gifts from everybody who has never given to the college yet, who's an alumnus. A lot of people crawl out of the woodwork and say, no kidding, I could help the place big time this way. It's not always a quadruple challenge, by the way, but.
Church board members, are you listening to this as a pledge drive activity? I want to call your attention, if you want to go to YouTube or these other places and write in Deep Springs College and CBS Sunday Morning News, you will find an 8-minute broadcast of the time when Jack was president. And I'd like for you to say a little bit about the time when you were president and that bridge you talked about, the financial and ideological crises.
Okay.
What was it like then, and what did you do about it?
Good. One of the times Deep Springs, by the way, the name of this book that I had in mind from the beginning was On the Edge, because Deep Springs is on the edge of the desert. It's on the edge of innovation in terms of educational philosophy, and it's been on the brink of oblivion a number of times. Well, one of those times that it was on the brink of oblivion was in 1995, and I had been on the board of trustees, and we had had a knockdown, drag-out battle over coeducation, which was resolved by not making a decision because it was a tie vote. So there were passionate feelings on both sides, and a tie vote gave nobody even a moral victory. On top of that, we had one of the trustees who was a Harvard Business School professor who did an analysis of our declining endowment and expenditures and said Deep Springs will go bankrupt in about 6 years. This experiment is going to be all over unless something very dramatic happens. And right when those two things were happening, I retired from the Board of Trustees, and Linda and I were ready to come back to Salt Lake City and after that last meeting and think about all the experiences we've had there and with the sadness in our hearts. I'm not going to burden you with the story, but ended up going back there the next summer as president. And I did it originally on a 3-year leave without pay from the University of Utah. And the task was, how do we take a college which is spending $750,000 a year and has a $1.3 million endowment, and an alumni base which is so distraught on two accounts. One, because the alumni were split about 50-50 over coeducation, a lot of people were so mad they didn't want to give unless they got their way. So we had people that were saying, I'm not going to give anymore unless you go coeducational. And others saying, if you do go coeducational, I'll never give again. And so we were in a pickle. So we hired a fundraising guru who helped us, and we knew we needed $10 million to save the college. Anything less than that would not do it. For one thing, the physical plant was shot. And so we got this analysis from the fundraising consultant who said, $5 million I think you could raise after studying the alumni. Maybe 7. You would throw discretion totally to the wind if you thought you could raise $10 million. The board met, Linda and I met with them, and we said, if we don't raise $10 million, it's over anyway. We have to commit to a $10 million campaign in 5 years, or this experiment is done. And we then engineered a truce between those who were in favor of coeducation, those who were against it, and the argument was, we obviously love this place so much that we're willing to practically kill each other over whether it's coeducational or not. Why don't we all lay down our arms, band together, save the college, and we can talk about coeducation later. So, Harold, within 3 years of the 5-year campaign, we had raised $10 million already. And the key to it, I think, was this. The trustees said, Jack, we want you to spend 80% of your time on the road raising money. And I said, no dice. This is when Linda and I were negotiating whether we would go over there or not. And they said, why? And I said, because people have lost faith in the college, that it's doing what we believe none founded it to do, the principles that I've talked about. And therefore, if we're going to get the alumni to band together and rally big to save the college, they've got to really believe in the college, that it's finally doing what we all expect it to do. So I got to spend my time almost entirely at Deep Springs, trying to rebuild the culture of selfless service to humanity. And if I'm able to do that, then when I go out to raise funds, people are going to say, oh, we've heard great things about what's happening at Deep Springs. And they would be willing to give. Well, that formula seemed to be the one that worked. So we went there with that bargain that I would spend most of my time at Deep Springs trying to rebuild the educational heart and soul of the college and then go from there. At the end of 5 years, we had $18.3 million. We'd almost doubled what we had gone for. Yes, please. Oh, sorry.
Could you explain? We have one here. Oh, sorry.
Can you tell us more about the day-to-day lives of the students and what you described to them as they were coming in about what their obligations would be, both educationally and in terms of maintaining and owning the college?
Sure. The daily life of the students, the students elect a labor commissioner who's kind of the foreman. And the labor commissioner has a responsibility to assign students to all the different jobs that need to be done. And those jobs range all the way from managing the library to herding the cattle to doing the orderly work, cleaning the buildings, janitorial work in effect. They cook the meals, they wash the dishes. They are involved in keeping all the farm machinery going. They bale the hay. No matter what needs to be done there, under the tutelage of staff members who have the skills, the students learn to do all that work. So if you happen to be on dairy, which the dairy, by the way, provides all the milk and dairy products for the college, then you're up every morning at 4 o'clock, you go down and milk, and then in the evening before dinner, you go milk again. You make the cheese, the yogurt, and so forth.
How is there time to study?
So you wonder that. And so one of the principles of the college is no going to town, no social life. So you stay there and you deal with the responsibilities of self-governance and of the college itself. And so it's a very, very intense life, emotionally, intellectually, and physically.
That was sort of the line of my question, but now it makes me wonder, how is this democracy managed if you as president don't have any power over them? Who decides who gets to get up at 4 in the morning? And also go into something I've heard you say before, the true power of these students over faculty and everything.
Yes.
I don't think everyone really understands that power they have.
That's true. So with regard to, say, labor assignments, that's the elected labor commissioner who has responsibility to assigning his peers to the jobs that they do, and then to monitor their work. And if the dairyman is not getting the cows milked and things are going, we're not having milk on our dinner tables, then it's up to the labor commissioner to replace that student or find some way to motivate him and get him to do the job right. In terms of students choosing the faculty, students choosing the courses that they're taught, students are in charge of the admission of the next entering class the following fall. I would describe it like this. I would talk with the students each year and I would say, when you do your job well, responsibly, I have almost nothing to do. I just cheer you on, and if you need some advice about something, I'm always here to talk. But if you take your responsibilities in a rather cavalier fashion and you hire faculty members without properly finding out if they really have the credentials that we need and so forth, then you're inviting me to intervene because I do have the power to intervene if I have to. But then that poisons the well. You're going to say, yeah, our student democracy means nothing because you can trump us. And I said, the way for me not to trump you is for you to do a whale of a good job. And it almost always works. There have been a few really tough times that Linda and I experienced during the decade we were there. We went originally, by the way, for 3 years and stayed for 9 altogether. You know, the students did make a couple of really bad decisions, and I had to say, I'm sorry, I can't let you do that. One of those was firing a faculty member without giving the person appropriate notice. It was an ethical issue, saying you're falling down on this and you need to improve. Instead, they just said, hey, we don't like it, you're out of here. And I said, oh, no, you don't. We've got ethical obligations here. That's one of the things that we're here to learn. And there was quite a firestorm over that.
On the issue of co-education,
Yeah.
what were the arguments for and against that among the trustees?
Thank you for asking. In the deed of trust, L.L. Nunn said, this college is founded for the purpose of educating promising young men to prepare for lives of leadership and service. Another phrase he loved was trustees of the nation. So, the people who opposed coeducation said, there is a sentence right there in the deed of trust. It's unequivocal. It says, this college is for the education of promising young men, period. That's it. There is no argument. So when the case was before the Superior Court in California just over a year ago, I was one of the witnesses for the college. And here was my argument. None, to my knowledge, and I've looked at thousands of documents, and so have Linda's, that he wrote and was involved in and so forth, mentioned young men once as a purpose that he had in mind. Thousands of times he talked about his dream of preparing leaders of society, trustees of the nation, et cetera, et cetera. So I said to the judge, once he mentioned promising young men, hundreds and thousands of times he talked about his dream of preparing leaders. Now, it would seem, therefore, that leadership was his main aim. When he was founding the college in 1917, if you were going to prepare leaders for the nation, and you were from the background that Nunn was, in terms of his culture, American culture at that time and so forth, you would say, well, if I'm going to prepare leaders, they're going to be men. Because Congress was all men, practically everything was all men, so I'm going to educate men. But Nunn, being the progressive thinker that he was, would certainly recognize today that men and women are serving in all kinds of leadership positions co-equally, and that men are going to serve under women, men are going to lead women, and women are going to have equal responsibility for the welfare of our society. Therefore, if you're going to realize Nunn's dream, if you're going to carry it into the present, you would have to admit women. You double the talent pool, and you prepare men and women to work together fruitfully in their careers. The nice thing is we had to win on one of 4 arguments in order for coeducation to carry legally. We won on 3 and got a draw on the 4th one. The judge basically was completely in favor of the trustees' action to become coeducational. But the dissenting trustees have appealed that decision to a higher court in California, so that's why we're still in limbo. And the backlog in that court is 3 years, so we could wait another 3 years at least before this can be implemented.
Thank you, Jack, for
You're
a
most welcome.
Insightful story. The story continues because, as you heard, Jack has written a book about this whole unusual chapter in American culture, and there's a table right outside the door where you may purchase copies of this book and others. So I encourage you to restrain your need for caffeine just long enough to stop by the book table. Also want to remind you of the anti-racist committee table where you can sign a card of encouragement to the church in Charleston and also make donations. The information about how you write the check and that sort of thing will be told you there. Finally, I was told by Linda that the Episcopal Church for this region is having a convention in Salt Lake City, and next Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, there will be a 7:45 at the Salt Palace. You say it, I'll just yell, or how about you saying the whole thing?
This is the National Convention of the Episcopal Church. There will be 30,000 Episcopalians descending on Salt Lake. And Bishop Scott Hayashi has organized a march against gun violence. And it will begin at 7:30 at the Salt Palace. You can go to the Episcopal webpage and get the rest of the information, but it's just a march against gun violence. I don't know anyone who is for gun violence, but and they'll march from there to Pioneer Park, and so you'll be done in time to come to church at 10.
Thank you. So let's close today with the reassurance that even in our darkest hours, morning comes again. Singers?